Our kid befriends a stray dog. Years later, that same dog saves his life in the most unexpected way. The night was cold, eerily quiet. The dim glow of a single street lamp flickered against the cracked pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a long, mournful cry that sent a shiver through the empty street. A lone figure sat on the curb, shoulders hunched, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn-out hoodie. He wasn't supposed to be here, but here he was, sitting, waiting, staring at the same door for 7 nights straight. A stray dog. Thin, scrappy, and covered in matted fur, the dog had made this spot his home. His ribs were visible beneath his dirt-streaked coat. But it wasn't. His frail body that made him unsettling. It was his eyes, they never left the door. The small, rusted door of an old house at the end of the alley. Who was inside? Why was the dog waiting? Each night the dog arrived like clockwork, curling up at the doorstep. He never barked, never scratched, never whined, just sat, waiting. And then, at sunrise, he would disappear, only to return again when night fell. Something wasn't right, and that's exactly what 10-year-old Oliver Parker thought when he first noticed the dog. Oliver wasn't the type of kid to ignore a mystery. His mother always said he had an eye for things most people didn't notice. But this was different. It started with curiosity. Every night after finishing his homework, Oliver would peek through his bedroom window, watching the strange dog take its place at the doorstep. The dog was always alone, unmoving, like a statue frozen in time. And yet, it wasn't just waiting. It was watching. Not just the door, but the world around it, like it was guarding something. Then came the moment that changed everything. One night, Oliver sneaked outside, stepping cautiously toward the stray. He expected it to growl, to bare its teeth, maybe even run, but it didn't move. It just looked at him, a slow, knowing gaze. Oliver swallowed. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Still no response. The silence stretched between them. Then, Oliver did something that surprised even himself. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a piece of bread and gently placed it on the ground. The dog didn't hesitate. With slow, deliberate movements, it leaned forward, sniffed the bread, and ate it. Oliver exhaled. "So you're hungry, huh?" For the first time, the dog's tail gave a weak, hesitant wag. That was the night everything changed. From that moment on, Oliver and the stray formed an unspoken routine. Each night, Oliver would sneak out, sit beside the dog and share his dinner. And each night the dog would sit, eat quietly, and then return to staring at the door. But Oliver had questions. Why this door? Was he waiting for someone? Had he been abandoned? And then there was the biggest mystery of all. Why did the dog's eyes seem so human? There was something deep in them. Sadness, recognition. Oliver didn't to know, but he was determined to find out. It was a stormy night when Oliver finally named him. The rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling through the alley. Oliver had been forced to stay inside, but he couldn't shake the thought of the stray out there alone in the storm. So against every bit of common sense, he grabbed his raincoat, snuck out the back door, and ran through the alley. And that's when he saw him. The dog wasn't just sitting at the doorstep anymore. He was standing, head low, ears pinned back, his frail body trembling. Not from cold, but from something else. Something Oliver couldn't see. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. "Buddy?" The dog didn't react. His gaze remained locked on the house. Thunder cracked. The door creaked. And then a single sound drifted through the storm. A whisper. Oliver's heart slammed against his ribs. His eyes darted to the door, expecting it to open. But it didn't. The house remained still, silent. But the dog's stance never changed. Oliver's fingers curled into fists. He had never seen the stray this way before, and that's when he decided the dog needed a name. Storm. It fit. Strong. Silent, unpredictable. Just like the night they met. And for the first time the dog reacted. His ears flicked. His body relaxed just slightly, and then, as if accepting his new name, he finally turned to look at Oliver. A moment passed, then another, And then something shifted. Storm took a single step forward, and Oliver knew. He had earned the dog's trust, but what he didn't know was that this bond would one day save his life. Days passed, then weeks. Oliver and Storm became inseparable. But the door never opened. No one came. No one left. Until one night. It started the same as always. Oliver sat beside Storm, feeding him bits of his sandwich, whispering stories about school and the kids who didn't understand why he liked animals more than people. Storm listened, silent as ever. And then, click. The door handle moved. Oliver's breath hitched. His grip tightened around his sandwich. Storm's entire body stiffened. Another click. Then, the slow creak of the door opening. Oliver's pulse roared in his ears. For the first time in weeks, someone was there, and as the door inched open, revealing the faint glow of a single light inside, Storm let out a low, guttural growl. Oliver's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The door swung open just a little more, enough for Oliver to see a shadow move inside. His fingers twitched. His body screamed at him to run, but then Storm lunged, and the screen cut to black. The night air was thick with tension. The door had opened just enough to cast a thin sliver of light onto the wet pavement. Oliver's breath was shallow, his heart pounding so hard he swore it echoed in the alley, but nothing was louder than the deep warning growl rumbling from Storm's throat. Oliver had never seen him like this before. The dog's body was tense, his stance rigid. His eyes, once filled with quiet sadness, now burned with something else, something primal. Then it happened. Storm lunged. Oliver barely had time to react. The dog shot forward like a shadow breaking free from the night. His growl turned into a bark, sharp, aggressive, unlike anything Oliver had heard from him before. A hand shot out from the darkness inside the house, trying to shove the door shut. But Storm was faster. His paws hit the wood with a thud, his body wedging into the small gap before it could close. Oliver stumbled backward, fear gripping his chest. He wanted to call out, "Stop Storm! Ask who was inside. Demand to know what was happening." But his voice wouldn't come. A strangled, desperate curse came from inside. The shadow moved again, retreating deeper into the house. And just like that, Storm stopped. He didn't move, didn't chase. He just stood there staring. Inside, Oliver swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides. "Storm?" The dog didn't respond. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, his breathing heavy. Then slowly, carefully, the door began to close. Oliver didn't know whether to run or stay. His legs felt rooted to the ground, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. But one thing was clear. Whoever was inside, Storm knew them. The door shut with a soft final click. Storm let out a breath, then turned, his eyes locking onto Oliver's. There was no mistaking the message in them. It's over for tonight. But it's not over. Oliver swallowed the lump in his throat and gave a shaky nod. He had to find out the truth. The next morning, Oliver did something he had never done before. He knocked on the door. He half expected no one to answer. Maybe the person inside would pretend they weren't there, like they had done for weeks. Maybe they were already gone. But no. The door creaked open an inch. Oliver barely had time to register the pair of wary, sunken eyes staring at him before a rough voice rasped, "Go home, kid." And the door slammed shut again. Storm let out a low whine. Oliver's jaw clenched. No, not this time. He raised his fist and knocked again, harder. "Who are you?" he called out. "Why does Storm know you?" Silence. Oliver took a step back, frustration bubbling in his chest. "He's been waiting here for weeks. You owe him an answer." Another long pause. Then, just when Oliver thought they weren't going to respond, a sigh, a tired, broken sigh, and the door opened. Not much, just enough for Oliver to get a glimpse inside. A dark room, the faint smell of dust and something bitter, and a man. Thin, unshaven, with deep lines creasing his face. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled like he hadn't slept in days. Storm tensed beside Oliver, his eyes locked onto the man's face. And the man. The man looked back at Storm like he was seeing a ghost. Oliver's heart pounded. He stepped forward. Who? The man exhaled sharply, his gaze shifting to Oliver. Where did you find him? Oliver hesitated. I didn't. He found me. The man's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His fingers twitched on the edge of the doorframe. He shouldn't be here, the man muttered. Oliver narrowed his eyes. Why not? The man didn't answer. Storm took a slow step forward, then another. His tail was low, ears perked, his movements hesitant, like he was trying to recognize something that had once been familiar. Oliver's pulse quickened. There was history here, something deeper than he had realized. And then, just as Storm reached the threshold of the door, the man muttered something so quietly Oliver almost didn't hear it. I thought you were dead. The words hit Oliver like a punch. Storm stiffened. His tail stopped moving. For the first time, Oliver saw it. The faintest flicker of recognition in the dog's eyes. The man's shoulders sagged. He looked down, shaking, his head. This isn't right, he whispered. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. Oliver's fingers curled into fists. Who are you? He asked again, this time more forcefully. The man finally met his gaze. His expression was guarded, haunted, but there was something else there too. Guilt. He inhaled deeply, then sighed. I'm the man who lost him, he said quietly. And you're the kid who found him. Oliver's mind spun. Questions slammed into him like waves crashing against the shore. What did that mean? What had happened to Storm? How did this man know him? Before he could ask, the man took a step back and reached for the door. I'm sorry, kid. And he shut it. Oliver stood there, stunned, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Storm, still staring at the door, let out a soft, almost broken whimper. The puzzle pieces were finally coming together. But something told Oliver he wasn't going to like the truth. Oliver sat on the cold pavement, his thoughts swirling. Storm lay beside him, his head resting on Oliver's lap, eyes still locked on the door that had just shut them out. The night air was thick, filled with questions, and the faint hum of streetlights flickering above. What had the man meant by, I thought you were dead? And why did Storm react like he recognized him, yet held back as if caught between past and present? Oliver's fingers gently stroked Storm's fur. What happened to you, boy? Storm let out a low whine, his eyes heavy with untold stories. Determination set in Oliver's jaw. If the man wouldn't talk, he'd have to find the answers himself. The next day, Oliver didn't go to school. Instead, he found himself at the local library, diving into old newspapers and online forums, searching for any mention of a missing dog, a mysterious man, an unsolved story. Hours passed, and just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, he found it, a small, almost forgotten article. Local man's dog missing after tragic fire, presumed dead. The photo was grainy, the ink faded, but there was no mistaking it. A younger, healthier version of Storm stood beside the man from the house, back when his eyes were bright, unscarred by loss. Oliver's breath hitched. He read on. A fire. The man Ethan Cole had lost everything. His home, his family, his dog. The article speculated that the dog Rex had perished in the blaze, but there was no confirmation. Just an assumption. Oliver's fingers trembled as he traced the outline of Storm. No, Rex. Rex, he whispered. The name felt foreign, yet familiar. He looked down at the dog by his side. You're Rex, he murmured. And he's your owner. Storm Rex lifted his head, ears twitching. It was like a spark, a tiny flicker of recognition, but just as quickly, it faded. Oliver returned to the house that evening, gripping the newspaper tightly in his hand. He knocked, each beat of his fist more determined than the last. Finally, the door opened a crack. Ethan's wary eyes peered out. What do you want, kid? Oliver held up the article. This is you, he said, his voice steady. And this is Rex. Ethan's face went pale. His eyes darted to the dog, then back to the newspaper. I told you to stay away, he muttered. trying to close the door. Oliver jammed his foot against it. "No, you don't get to just ignore this. He's been waiting for you." A flash of pain crossed Ethan's features. "That's not my dog," he whispered. "Yes, he is." Oliver's voice cracked. "He remembers you. I can see it." Ethan shook his head, retreating further into the shadows. "I can't do this," he muttered. "Not again." With that, the door slammed shut, leaving Oliver and Rex alone once more. Days turned into weeks. Oliver continued to bring Rex to the doorstep every evening. He willed Ethan to open the door, to acknowledge the dog he had once loved, but every time the door remained closed. Rex grew restless. He would pace back and forth, scratching at the wood, whining softly as if calling out to someone he couldn't fully remember, and Oliver he began to doubt. Maybe Ethan was right, maybe the fire had changed Rex beyond recognition. Maybe the bond they once shared was lost forever. But then one evening something changed. Oliver sat beside Rex, absently tossing an old rubber ball he had found at the bottom of a bargain bin. Rex's eyes followed the ball, his ears perking. "Up with each bounce, go get it," Oliver said softly, rolling the ball a few feet away. Rex hesitated, his body tense. "Come on, boy," Oliver coaxed, "just like old times." A flicker of something, determination, memory, flashed in Rex's eyes. Slowly he stood. His paws moved cautiously, his gaze never leaving the ball. And then, with a tentative step, he lunged forward, snatching the ball between his teeth. Oliver's heart soared. "Good boy," he cheered, reaching out to pet him. But the moment his hand touched Rex's fur, the dog froze. His eyes widened, his body trembling. Oliver pulled back, confusion swirling in his mind. "What's wrong?" Rex dropped the ball, his eyes shifting from Oliver to the house and back again. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not of aggression but of fear. Oliver's stomach twisted. "Rex?" The dog backed away, retreating into the shadows of the alley. Something had triggered him, something dark, buried deep, and just as Oliver was about to follow, the door opened. Ethan stepped out, his face shadowed, his eyes hollow. "I tried to save him," he whispered, "but the fire, he was trapped." Oliver's fists clenched. "But he got out." Ethan shook his head. "No." He ran back in. "For her." Oliver's brow furrowed. "For who?" A tear glistened in Ethan's eye. "My daughter." The words hung heavy in the air. "She didn't make it," Ethan choked out, "and Rex, he was never the same." Oliver's mind reeled. The pieces were falling into place, the picture becoming painfully clear. Rex had run into the flames to save someone he loved, and he'd failed. Oliver turned to look at the dog, now half hidden in the shadows. "Rex." But Rex didn't move. His body trembled, his eyes filled with the ghosts of the past. Ethan's voice broke. "I couldn't face him, not after that." Oliver's chest tightened. "He's been waiting for you every night." Ethan's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. "I couldn't do it, couldn't look him in." The eyes, knowing I let them both down. Tears stung Oliver's eyes. "But he's here now, and so are you." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Rex's. There was pain, deep, unhealed. But there was something else too. Hope. Slowly, Ethan knelt down, his voice barely a whisper. "Rex?" The dog flinched, his muscles tense. But he didn't run. Ethan took a shaky breath, reaching out a trembling hand. "I'm so sorry, boy." Rex's eyes flicked between Oliver and Ethan, uncertain, torn between past and present. Oliver knelt beside Ethan, his voice soft. "It's okay, Rex. He's here." A long, painful silence stretched between them. Then, with a hesitant step, Rex moved forward. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes glistening. "That's it, boy," he murmured. "I'm right here." Rex's nose twitched, his body trembling, and then he leaned in, pressing his head against Ethan's chest. A sob escaped Ethan's lips as his arms wrapped around the dog. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Rex whined softly, his body finally relaxing. Oliver watched, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and sorrow. But even as the reunion unfolded before him, a shadow of doubt lingered, because as much as Rex leaned into Ethan's embrace, his eyes remained locked on the house. The past wasn't done with them yet. And somewhere, deep inside, Oliver knew this was only the beginning. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that carried unspoken words and memories that refused to fade. Oliver sat on the cold pavement, watching Ethan and Rex, two souls reunited but still trapped by the past. Rex leaned into Ethan's embrace, his body trembling, but his eyes remained locked on the house, as if something still held him back. Ethan wiped his tear-streaked face and whispered, "I never thought I'd see you again, boy." His fingers ran through Rex's fur, pausing when they brushed against the long, jagged scar on his neck. Ethan's body tensed. "How did you get this?" His voice was barely audible. Oliver hesitated before answering. "I don't know everything. But I do know someone hurt him after the fire." Ethan's breath hitched. He looked into Rex's eyes, searching for something, recognition, pain, guilt. "Who did this to you?" he murmured. Rex flinched, a low whine escaping his throat. He shifted uncomfortably, his body tensing as if an invisible chain still held him back. Then, without warning, Rex turned and bolted toward the house. "Rex!" Oliver shouted, scrambling to his feet. Ethan staggered forward, his eyes wide with panic. "No, don't go in there!" But Rex didn't stop. He shoved his nose against the door, scratching wildly at the wood, his whimpers growing frantic. Oliver and Ethan rushed after him, and Ethan's shaking hands fumbled with his keys. He hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. "What is it?" Oliver asked, breathless. Ethan swallowed hard. He never wanted to come back here, not once. Click. The door creaked open, and Rex darted inside. The house was cold, the air thick with the scent of dust and memories long buried. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly figures in the dim light. The only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps and Rex's paws padding across the wooden floor. Then he stopped. In the middle of the living room, Rex stood frozen, his gaze fixed on a small charred rocking chair, Ethan's face drained of color. Oliver stepped closer. "What is it?" Ethan's voice cracked. "That was hers." A lump formed in Oliver's throat. "Your daughter?" Ethan nodded, his hands clenched into fists. "She loved that chair. Every night she'd sit there with Rex reading stories." His voice wavered. "That's where I saw them last, before the fire." Rex let out a soft whimper, stepping closer to the chair. He sniffed it cautiously, his ears flicking back. Then something changed. A deep, gut-wrenching growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan and Oliver stiffened. Rex's body went rigid, his gaze locked onto the corner of the room. His growl grew louder, his fur standing on end. Oliver's heart pounded. "What's wrong?" Ethan followed Rex's gaze, and his face twisted in horror. A single door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The basement. Rex took a slow step forward, his growl turning into something primal. His tail was stiff, his eyes dark pools of something indescribable. And then he lunged. He slammed his body against the basement door, barking furiously. His claws raked against the wood, each scratch more desperate than the last. Ethan stumbled, back shaking his head. "No, no, no, there's nothing down there." Oliver's blood ran cold. "Then why is he acting like this?" Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. I never went back down there after the fire." Rex barked again, his entire body vibrating with urgency. Oliver stepped forward, pressing his hand against the door. The wood was old, splintered at the edges. "We have to see." Ethan was trembling. I can't go down there." Oliver turned to him, his voice steady. "Then I will." Without waiting for an answer, he reached for the rusted handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that spiraled into darkness. A damp, musty smell drifted up, thick and suffocating. Rex didn't hesitate. He darted down the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. Oliver swallowed his fear and followed. The basement was cold, the air heavy with something unspoken. The dim light from a single flickering bulb revealed stacks of forgotten boxes, covered furniture, and a shattered mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Rex was standing in the center of the room, his nose pressed against the floor. He let out a soft, mournful whine before turning his head toward Oliver, and that's when Oliver saw it. A burned collar, partially buried beneath the debris. Its once red leather was now blackened and cracked. The metal tag was rusted, but the name was still visible. Oliver's breath caught. Rex nudged the collar gently with his nose, then let out a heartbreaking whimper. A lump formed in Oliver's throat. "This was yours, wasn't it?" The dog didn't move. He simply stared at the collar, his body trembling. Then footsteps echoed down the stairs. Ethan stood frozen at the bottom step, his eyes locked on the collar. "I buried that," he whispered. Oliver turned to him, confused. "What?" Ethan's face was pale. "After the fire. I couldn't bear to see it. I buried it in the backyard." His voice wavered. "But it's here." The weight of his words sank in. Someone had brought it back. Oliver's mind raced. Who would do that? And why? And then he noticed something else. Scratches on the basement wall, faint but deliberate. Claw marks trailing downward, as if someone had tried to escape. A shiver ran down Oliver's spine. He turned to Ethan. "You said you never came down here after the fire." Ethan nodded, his throat bobbing. Oliver hesitated before asking the question, clawing at his mind. "Are you sure she never made it?" Ethan's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" Oliver gestured to the scratches. "What if she was trying to get out?" Ethan staggered back, his entire body shaking. "No," he whispered. I pulled her out, I swear I did." Oliver didn't know what to believe, but Rex seemed to, because in that moment the dog stepped forward, his nose pressed against Ethan's hand. He whimpered softly, his tail wagging just once. Ethan dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as they gripped Rex's fur. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry, boy." Rex nuzzled against him, letting out a deep, relieved sigh. Was forgiveness a bridge across years of guilt and pain? And for the first time in a long time, Ethan let himself cry. Oliver watched as man and dog clung to each other, a lifetime of sorrow melting into something new, something healing. But even as the moment settled, one question still haunted him. If Ethan buried the collar, who brought it back? And in the quiet, a whisper of wind brushed through the basement, carrying the faintest sound, the soft creak of a rocking chair upstairs. The house stood still in the dead of night, yet something had shifted. The weight of years of sorrow and unanswered questions lingered in the air, but for the first time it felt like the ghosts of the past were finally being laid to rest. Ethan clung to Rex, his fingers buried deep in the dog's thick fur, his body racked with silent sobs. The realization that his best friend had carried the burden of that night, of the fire, of his daughter's absence, was almost too much to bear. Oliver took a slow step forward, his eyes still locked on the rocking chair upstairs. It had moved. He was sure of it. The faint creak still echoed in his mind, sending a chill down his spine, but there was no one else here, at least, no one they could see. Rex let out a low whimper, pressing his head against Ethan's chest. He had been waiting for this moment. Through the pain, the separation, the unspoken memories, he had been waiting for Ethan to finally come back. Ethan took a shuddering breath and whispered, "I should have looked for you. I thought you were gone, boy. I thought—" His voice broke. Rex only licked his hand in response, his tail wagging ever so slightly. "Forgiveness, sir." Oliver swallowed hard, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. He glanced down at the burned collar in his hand, its rusted tag glinting under the dim basement light. There were still too many questions left unanswered. How had it ended up here? Who, or what, had left those scratch marks on the wall? And why did Rex still seem so alert? Ethan must have sensed his unease because he slowly pulled himself together and stood up, still holding on to Rex as if afraid to let go. He looked at Oliver, his face lined with exhaustion, but also something else. Acceptance. "I need to know, "What happened that night?" he said, his voice steadier now. "I need to know if she ever made it out." Oliver hesitated before nodding. "Then let's find out." Together, they made their way back upstairs, Rex staying close to Ethan's side. The moment they stepped into the living room, the air seemed heavier. The chair, Emily's chair, stood motionless in its corner, but the sense of presence remained. Ethan took a deep breath. He walked forward and knelt beside the chair, his fingers grazing the armrest. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "If you're here, if you ever were, I'm sorry." Were. Silence. Oliver watched as Ethan's hands clenched. "I should have looked harder. I should have never stopped searching for Rex, for you, for the truth." He exhaled shakily. "But I'm here now, and I won't leave again." A cold breeze swept through the room. The windows were closed, the doors locked, and yet the air stirred, carrying something gentle, something warm. Rex lifted his head suddenly, his ears perking up. He stared at the chair, his body completely still. Then his tail wagged. Once, twice. A slow, deep wag filled with quiet understanding. Ethan's breath hitched. He wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but for the briefest second, the air smelled different. Not of dust or charred wood, but of lilacs. Emily's favorite scent. A lump formed in his throat. He closed his eyes, letting the moment settle deep into his bones. "Goodbye, baby girl," he whispered, and just like that, the house seemed lighter. Rex let out a soft huff, then rested his head on Ethan's lap. There was no more tension in his body, no more trembling. Oliver felt the shift too. He didn't need answers anymore. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some were just meant to be felt. The sun rose in soft golden hues over the small town, casting a warm glow over everything it touched. For the first time in years, Ethan stood on the front porch of his old home, Rex sitting beside him like they'd never been apart. Oliver leaned against the railing, watching the two in silence. "What happens now?" he finally asked. Ethan ran a hand through Rex's fur, his expression thoughtful. "We start over," he said simply. "Me and him. We move forward." He looked down at the dog, who was now gazing up at him with complete trust, his past fears washed away. "Together," Oliver smiled. "That sounds like a good plan." Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah." Then he turned to his friend. "Thank you, Oliver, for everything." Oliver shrugged. "I didn't do much." "You did more than you know." A comfortable silence stretched between them. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt unbearable. Rex stood, stretched, and nudged Ethan's leg, his tail wagging. For the first time in years, the dog seemed truly at peace. And as Ethan looked out at the world ahead of them, he realized so was he.